There are moments in life when God's ways don't make sense. We pray, yet the answer delays. We obey, yet the door closes. We trust, yet the road gets harder. And in those moments, we are tempted to question not just God's plan, but God's character. But Scripture reminds us that God never asks us to understand His ways before we trust Him. He asks us to trust Him because His ways are higher than ours. When God is working, He is often doing more than we can see, more than we can feel, and more than we can imagine. Too often, we want God to explain Himself before we obey Him. But faith doesn't come with a full itinerary. It comes with a relationship. Trusting God means believing that even when the path is unclear, the guide is trustworthy. You may not know where He is taking you, but you can be confident that He knows exactly what He is doing. God's ways are not random, they are purposeful. What feels like a delay is often preparation. What feels like a denial may be protection. What feels like a setback may be a setup for something greater than you asked for. God sees the end from the beginning, and He is always working for His glory and your good, even when the process is uncomfortable. When we trust God's ways, we shift from panic to peace. We stop trying to control outcomes and start surrendering to His authority. Trust doesn't mean the absence of pain. It means the presence of confidence in the middle of it. Confidence that God is faithful. Confidence that God is sovereign. Confidence that God will finish what He started. So today, choose trust over fear. Choose obedience over understanding. Choose faith over frustration. Because you trust God's ways, you place your life in hands that have never failed and never will. God's ways operate on a level far beyond human understanding because they flow from His eternal wisdom rather than our limited perspective. As human beings, we see life in fragments. We see moments, circumstances, and immediate outcomes, but God sees the full picture. He sees the end from the beginning, the purpose behind the process, and the outcome behind the obstacle. When we try to evaluate God's actions using human reasoning alone, we often misinterpret what He is doing. That is why trusting God requires more than logic. It requires faith rooted in who He is. Our understanding is shaped by time, emotion, and experience. When something goes wrong, we instinctively ask why. We want explanations that fit our logic and timelines. But God is not confined to time, nor does He operate according to our emotional responses. His wisdom is eternal, consistent, and perfect. What looks confusing to us is often crystal clear to Him. The challenge is not that God's ways are flawed, but that our vision is limited. We look at situations through the lens of pain or convenience, while God looks through the lens of purpose. Human reasoning often demands immediate clarity, but God's wisdom often unfolds progressively. He rarely reveals the entire plan at once because full understanding is not the foundation of trust. Relationship is. If God explained everything in advance, trust would be replaced by control. Instead, He invites us to walk by faith, step by step, relying on His character rather than our comprehension. This is why trust becomes most necessary when understanding is least available. There are moments when obedience to God will seem illogical by human standards. Doing the right thing may cost us opportunities, relationships, or comfort. Following God's direction may lead us into seasons of waiting, uncertainty, or sacrifice. Yet God's wisdom accounts for realities we cannot perceive. He knows the consequences of choices before they happen. He understands how today's obedience shapes tomorrow's outcome. What feels like a loss in the moment may be God preventing a greater loss we cannot see. God's higher ways also challenge our tendency to measure success by visible results. We often equate progress with speed and blessing with ease. But God values depth over display and character over comfort. He is more concerned with who we are becoming than how quickly we arrive. That is why His ways sometimes include struggle, refinement, and delay. These are not signs of abandonment. They are tools of development. God's wisdom uses pressure to produce maturity and testing to strengthen faith. Trusting God's higher ways means accepting that he does not owe us an explanation to remain trustworthy. His faithfulness is not dependent on our understanding. Even when circumstances contradict our expectations, his nature remains unchanged. He is still good. He is still sovereign. He is still in control. Trust grows when we anchor ourselves in what we know about God rather than what we do not understand about our situation. When we acknowledge that God's ways are higher, we learn humility. We stop placing ourselves at the center and recognize God as the ultimate authority. This shift changes how we respond to uncertainty. Instead of panic, we develop patience. Instead of resistance, we practice surrender. Trusting God's wisdom does not mean we ignore questions or suppress emotions. It means we submit them to a God whose understanding is perfect. In doing so, we find peace. Not because everything makes sense, but because we know the one who holds everything together. Faith is often misunderstood as believing only when everything is clear. But biblical faith operates in the opposite direction. It calls for obedience even when full explanations are absent. God frequently invites his people to move forward without providing every detail because faith is not rooted in information, it is rooted in trust. If we required complete understanding before acting, faith would be unnecessary. Obedience becomes meaningful precisely because it is exercised in uncertainty. Human nature prefers clarity before commitment. We want guarantees, timelines, and outcomes before we take a step. Yet God's pattern throughout Scripture shows that he reveals direction progressively. He gives enough light for the next step, not the entire journey. This approach keeps us dependent on him rather than confident in a plan. When we obey without full explanation, we acknowledge that God's authority outweighs our need for control. We declare that his word is sufficient, even when his reasons are not immediately apparent. Obedience without explanation tests the depth of our trust. It forces us to decide whether we follow God for his benefits or for who he is. When the path makes sense, obedience feels safe. But when God's instruction challenges logic, comfort, or personal preference, obedience becomes an act of surrender. In those moments, faith moves from theory to practice. We choose to believe that God's wisdom surpasses our understanding and that his intentions are good, even when the outcome is uncertain. God often withholds full explanation because premature understanding can undermine spiritual growth. If we knew every challenge in advance, fear might paralyze us. If we knew every blessing ahead of time, pride might overtake us. By revealing his will in stages, God shapes our character along the way. Each act of obedience strengthens spiritual muscles, making us more sensitive to his voice and more confident in his leadership. Trust grows not from explanations, but from repeated experiences of God's faithfulness. Obedience without explanation also realigns our priorities. It teaches us that success is not defined by immediate results, but by faithfulness. The world rewards outcomes, but God honors obedience. When we act on his instruction without knowing how things will turn out, we shift our focus from results to relationship. We begin to value walking with God more than arriving at a destination. This perspective frees us from anxiety and performance-driven faith, allowing us to rest in God's sovereignty. There is also a refining aspect to this kind of obedience. When God calls us to act without full clarity, it exposes areas of resistance, fear, and self-reliance. We discover what we truly trust. Obedience becomes a mirror, revealing whether we are guided by faith or driven by comfort. As we submit those areas to God, he transforms them. What once felt risky becomes a testimony of his faithfulness. Ultimately, obedience without explanation positions us to experience God in deeper ways. When we step out in faith, we create space for God to move. We witness his provision, guidance, and protection firsthand. These experiences build a personal history with God that explanations alone could never provide. Faith matures as we learn that God's commands are not burdensome but purposeful. Even when we do not understand the why, we can trust the who. And in that trust, obedience becomes not a duty, but a declaration that God is worthy to be followed, no matter the uncertainty. Delays and denials often feel like rejection, but from a divine perspective, they can be acts of protection and preparation. When something we desire does not happen on our timeline or does not happen at all, it is easy to assume that God is withholding something good. Yet God's wisdom takes into account dangers we cannot see and outcomes we cannot predict. What appears to be a closed door may be God shielding us from consequences that would harm us spiritually, emotionally, or even physically. God's refusal is never careless. It is calculated by love and informed by perfect knowledge. Human beings tend to evaluate God's responses based on immediate comfort or visible progress. When prayers are answered quickly, we see God as faithful. When answers are delayed or denied, we question his involvement. But delay does not mean denial of care, and denial does not mean absence of love. God's timing is shaped by readiness, not urgency. He understands that receiving something too early can be just as damaging as never receiving it at all. Delay allows God to develop our character so that we can handle the blessing without being destroyed by it. Preparation is often hidden in seasons of waiting. While we are focused on what we lack, God is focused on who we are becoming. Waiting stretches our patience, deepens our dependence, and strengthens our discernment. These internal developments are essential because blessings that arrive without preparation often lead to pride, misuse, or misplaced identity. God cares not only about what he gives, but about the condition of the heart that receives it. Delay then becomes an instrument of growth rather than a sign of neglect. Denial can be even more difficult to accept because it feels final. Yet God's no is sometimes the clearest evidence of his protection. He sees relationships that would derail our purpose, opportunities that would distract us from our calling, and paths that would compromise our integrity. What we perceive as loss may actually be rescue. God's refusal is not punishment, it is prevention. He blocks certain doors not to frustrate us, but to preserve us. God also uses delay and denial to realign our desires. Sometimes what we ask for reveals more about our wants than our needs. In waiting, our motives are purified. We learn to seek God's will rather than just his gifts. This shift deepens our relationship with him and teaches us to trust his judgment over our emotions. As our desires align with his purposes, we become more receptive to what he wants to do in and through us. There is also a spiritual maturity that emerges when we learn to trust God in unanswered prayers. Faith that only survives on favorable outcomes is shallow. But faith that remains steady in delay and denial becomes resilient. It learns to rest in God's character rather than his activity. This kind of trust produces peace, even when circumstances remain unresolved. We stop striving for control and start surrendering to God's wisdom. Over time, many delays and denials reveal themselves as divine redirection. What once felt like a setback becomes the very thing that positioned us for something better. God's plans are not limited by our expectations. He often exceeds them, but only after teaching us to trust him beyond our preferences. When we look back, we begin to see that God was not withholding. He was preparing. He was not rejecting. He was protecting. And in that realization, gratitude replaces frustration and trust deepens into confident faith. Human nature gravitates toward control because control creates the illusion of security. We plan, organize, calculate, and strategize in an effort to manage outcomes and protect ourselves from disappointment. While wisdom and preparation have their place, Problems arise when control becomes a substitute for trust in God. When life moves beyond our ability to manage it, anxiety increases, frustration grows, and peace disappears. Trusting God invites us to release the burden of control and rest in His authority, which is where true peace is found. Control is rooted in fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of loss. We attempt to control circumstances because we believe that if we manage every detail, we can prevent pain. But control has limits. It cannot stop unexpected loss, unforeseen challenges, or sudden change. When we cling to control, we place the weight of outcomes on ourselves, a burden we were never meant to carry. God's authority, by contrast, is unlimited. He governs what we cannot predict and sustains what we cannot hold together. Surrender does not mean passivity or irresponsibility. It means recognizing who is ultimately in charge. When we surrender to God, we acknowledge that while we are responsible for obedience, God is responsible for results. This distinction is crucial. Control tries to force outcomes, while surrender focuses on faithfulness. As we release our need to manipulate circumstances, we gain freedom from constant worry. Peace emerges not because everything is resolved, but because we trust the one who oversees everything. Trusting God shifts our internal posture. Instead of reacting with panic when plans fall apart, we respond with prayer and patience. Instead of obsessing over what might go wrong, we focus on what God has already promised. This shift does not eliminate challenges, but it changes how we experience them. The same storm that produces anxiety in a controlling heart produces calm in a surrendered one. Peace is not the absence of trouble, it is the presence of confidence in God's rule. Letting go of control also exposes areas of pride and self-reliance. We often overestimate our ability to manage life and underestimate our dependence on God. Surrender humbles us, reminding us that we are not self-sufficient. This humility opens the door for God's strength to work through our weakness. When we stop insisting on our own way, we create space for God to act in ways we could never orchestrate ourselves. Peace grows as we practice surrender consistently. Trust is not a one-time decision, it is a daily posture. Each day presents new opportunities to either reclaim control or reaffirm trust. As we choose surrender again and again, our confidence in God deepens. We begin to recognize patterns of His faithfulness. Situations that once caused anxiety lose their power over us because we have seen God come through before. Ultimately, surrender aligns us with God's authority rather than our limited perspective. It allows us to live with open hands instead of clenched fists. In that posture, peace becomes sustainable, not circumstantial. We rest, not because life is predictable, but because God is dependable. When trust replaces control, the heart finds stability. We learn that peace is not something we manufacture through effort. It is something we receive when we place our confidence fully in God's sovereign care. God's work is always purposeful, even when it is not immediately visible. He is never idle, never distracted, and never uncertain about what He is doing. While human effort is often inconsistent and incomplete, God's work flows from His unchanging character. He acts with intention, guided by His glory and motivated by love for His people. This means that every season of life, whether marked by joy or hardship, exists within the framework of His divine plan. God's glory is the ultimate aim of everything He does. This does not mean that He is indifferent to human needs. Rather, His glory and our good are deeply connected. When God reveals His power, faithfulness, and wisdom, it ultimately benefits those who trust Him. His glory is expressed through His ability to redeem broken situations, bring meaning out of suffering, and produce hope where despair once ruled. What seems like chaos to us often becomes a canvas for God to display His greatness. At the same time, God is committed to the good of His people. His definition of good, however, is far broader than comfort or convenience. God's good includes growth, transformation, and alignment with His purposes. There are moments when hardship serves our long-term good more effectively than ease ever could. God is less concerned with preserving our comfort than with shaping our character. Through trials, he develops perseverance. Through challenges, he refines faith. Through adversity, he teaches dependence on him. It is important to understand that God's work is continuous, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Silence does not mean absence. Waiting does not mean inactivity. God often works behind the scenes, arranging details, changing hearts, and positioning circumstances in ways we cannot perceive. Just because we do not see immediate progress does not mean God is not moving. His timing operates with precision, and his plans unfold according to his wisdom, not our urgency. God's commitment to finishing his work brings assurance in uncertain times. He does not abandon what he begins. Human projects are often left incomplete due to lack of resources or shifting priorities, but God never runs out of power or focus. What he starts, he sustains. Even when we falter, his faithfulness remains. Our weaknesses do not cancel his promises. Instead, they often become the very places where his strength is most evident. Trust grows as we recognize patterns of God's faithfulness over time. Looking back, many can see how moments of confusion eventually led to clarity, and seasons of struggle produced unexpected growth. These reflections strengthen confidence in God's ongoing work. They remind us that present difficulties are part of a larger story that God is writing with care and precision. Believing that God is always working for his glory and our good transforms how we interpret life. Instead of viewing hardship as meaningless, we see it as purposeful. Instead of despairing in uncertainty, we lean into hope. This perspective does not deny pain, but it redeems it. We learn to trust that God's hands are steady, his heart is faithful, and his plans are sure. Even when outcomes are unclear, we rest in the assurance that God is working and his work will ultimately reflect his glory and accomplish our good.